Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
It was hard to believe that I would find myself embroiled in a feud with a neighbor, but life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges your way. It all started when I moved into this quaint little neighborhood, thinking I'd found the perfect spot to settle down. The tree-lined streets and well-manicured lawns gave off an air of tranquility that I craved after years of living in the bustling city center. Little did I know that my peace would be shattered by the most unexpected of sources: a landscaper with a penchant for collecting junk. My neighbor, let's call him Mike, ran his landscaping business from his home just down the block. At first, I didn't think much of it. Live and let live, right? But as the days went by, I started to notice a pattern that would soon become the bane of my existence. Mike owned a small fleet of vehicles, 7 in total, ranging from beat-up pickup trucks to a massive stake bed truck that looked like it had seen better days. Every trash day, without fail, he'd be up at the crack of dawn, cruising the neighborhood in search of discarded treasures. Appliances, furniture, you name it. If it was by the curb, Mike would snatch it up. Now, I'm all for recycling and giving old items a new lease on life, but Mike's methods left much to be desired. You see, he had this habit of parking his loaded-up truck right in front of my house while I was at work. At first, I tried to brush it off as a minor inconvenience. But then I started noticing the gifts he was leaving behind. Trash would mysteriously fall off his truck and into my yard. Old toasters, broken lamps, even a rusty bicycle frame once, all left for me to clean up. It was like having my own personal landfill, courtesy of Mike's sloppy collection practices. I'm not one for confrontation, but after a few weeks of this, I decided it was time to have a chat with my neighbor. One Saturday morning, I walked over to Mike's house, plastering on my friendliest smile. "Hey there, Mike," I called out as he tinkered with one of his trucks in the driveway. He looked up, wiping his greasy hands on an even greasier rag. "Oh hey, it's John," I reminded him, trying not to let my irritation show. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about your truck." "The big one?" Mike's eyes narrowed slightly. "What about it?" I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Well, I've noticed you've been parking it in front of my house quite often, and sometimes stuff falls off into my yard. I was wondering if you could maybe park it somewhere else, or at least make sure nothing falls out." Mike stared at me for a long moment, then burst out laughing. "That's just how it goes, buddy. Can't control where stuff lands sometimes, and your spot's the most convenient for me. No harm, no foul, right?" I felt my jaw clench. "Actually, it is a problem for me. I have to clean up the mess, and it's not really fair." "Look," Mike cut me off, his tone losing all pretense of friendliness. "I've been doing this for years, never had any complaints. If you don't like it, maybe you should move somewhere else." With that, he turned his back on me and went back to working on his truck. I stood there for a moment, stunned by his dismissive attitude, before trudging back to my house. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything I could think of to resolve the situation peacefully. I left polite notes on Mike's windshield. I tried talking to him again, only to be ignored, and I even baked cookies for his family as a peace offering. Nothing worked. The truck kept appearing and the trash kept falling. Frustrated, I turned to the authorities for help. I called the police department, explaining the situation and hoping they could intervene. The officer on the phone sounded sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. "I'm sorry, sir, but as long as the vehicle isn't violating any parking laws, there's not much we can do," she explained. "Have you tried talking to your neighbor about it?" I bit back a sarcastic reply. "Yes, multiple times. He doesn't seem to care." "Well, I'm afraid this falls under the category of a civil dispute. We can't get involved unless there's a clear violation of the law." Defeated, I hung up and tried the parking enforcement office next. They gave me the same runaround. Unless Mike was breaking specific parking regulations, their hands were tied. As the months wore on, I found myself becoming obsessed with the situation. I'd wake up early just to see if Mike had parked his truck out front again. I'd spend my lunch breaks picking up the debris that had fallen into my yard. My once peaceful home had become a source of constant stress and anger. Then came the COVID pandemic, and with it, an unexpected silver lining. My company announced that we'd be working remotely for the foreseeable future. Suddenly, I was home all day, every day. And while that might have driven some people stir-crazy, for me, it was an opportunity. You see, being home meant I could keep a closer eye on Mike's comings and goings. I started noticing patterns in his behavior: when he'd leave for his trash-picking rounds, how long he'd be gone, and most importantly, where he'd park when he returned. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched Mike drive off in his stake bed truck, an idea began to form. It was petty, sure, but after months of frustration, I was past caring about taking the high road. I went out to my driveway and got into my work vehicle, a company car I used for service calls. With a small smile playing on my lips, I carefully maneuvered it to the curb, positioning it in such a way that when Mike returned, he'd have a choice to make. He could either park slightly into the red zone in front of a fire hydrant or find somewhere else to leave his truck. As I walked back into the house, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Part of me hoped Mike would just park somewhere else and be done with it. But another part, a part one wasn't entirely proud of, hoped he'd take the bait. Hours ticked by as I pretended to work, my eyes constantly darting to the window. Finally, I heard the rumble of Mike's truck coming down the street. I watched through the blinds as he slowed down, clearly confused by the new obstacle in his usual parking spot. For a moment he just sat there, engine idling. Then, with a visible shrug, he pulled forward and parked his truck partially in the red zone, the back end blocking the fire hydrant. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and snapped several pictures, making sure to capture clear evidence of the violation. With slightly shaking hands, I composed an email to the parking enforcement office, the police department, and for good measure, the public relations officer of the local fire department. I attached the photos and hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I waited. The response came faster than I expected. About 2 hours after I sent the email, I heard the unmistakable sound of a parking enforcement vehicle pulling up outside. From my vantage point at the window, I watched as the officer got out, examined Mike's truck, and began writing a ticket. Just as the officer was finishing up, Mike came bursting out of his house, red-faced and shouting. I couldn't make out the words, but his wild gesticulations told me all I needed to know. The parking enforcement officer remained calm, handing Mike the ticket before driving away. I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. Not 5 minutes later, my doorbell rang, followed by angry pounding on the door. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. As I opened the door, keeping the security chain in place, Mike's furious face came into view. "You," he spat, jabbing a finger in my direction. "This is your fault," I feigned innocence. "I'm sorry. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me," Mike shouted, his face growing redder by the second. "You parked your car there on purpose. You made it impossible for me to park legally." I raised an eyebrow, struggling to keep my composure. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mike. I always park my work vehicle there when I'm home. And from what I can see, there are plenty of other spots available on the street. You didn't have to park in front of the hydrant." Mike's eyes bulged. "You know damn well that's my spot. I've been parking there for years. It's a public street, Mike," I replied, my voice level. "No one owns any particular spot. And besides, I thought you'd be happy to park closer to your own house for a change." That set him off again. He started yelling about how I'd ruined his business, how he couldn't afford the ticket, how I was a terrible neighbor. I let him rant, knowing that every shouted word was just digging him deeper. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I heard sirens approaching. Someone, probably one of the other neighbors, had called the police about the disturbance. 2 officers pulled up, quickly assessing the situation. One of them gently led Mike away, speaking to him in low, calming tones. The other approached me, notepad in hand. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" the officer asked. I gave him a rundown of the events, careful to stick to the facts. As I spoke, I could see Mike gesticulating wildly to the other officer, his face still flushed with anger. "And this has been an ongoing issue?" the officer asked, jotting down notes. I nodded. "For months now, I've tried talking to him about it, but he refuses to park anywhere else or clean up the trash that falls from his truck." The officer's eyebrows rose. "Trash? Yes," I explained. "He picks up discarded items on trash day and often leaves debris in my yard. I've had to clean it up myself multiple times." As we talked, I could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. He asked a few more questions about Mike's business practices, including how often he parked on the street and what kind of items he typically collected. Finally, he closed his notebook and gave me a nod. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. We'll look into this matter further." I watched as the 2 officers conferred briefly before approaching Mike again. Their conversation was too quiet for me to hear, but I could see Mike's face changing from anger to disbelief to something close to panic. After what felt like an eternity, the officers left, and Mike stomped back to his house without so much as a glance in my direction. I closed my door, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Something told me this wasn't over yet. I was right. The next day, I received a call from the police department. The officer I spoke to informed me that after investigating the situation, they had discovered that Mike's business was operating in violation of several local ordinances. Not only was he not supposed to be parking commercial vehicles on residential streets overnight, but the weight of his fully loaded truck exceeded the limits for our neighborhood roads. "We've issued Mr. Johnson a formal notice," the officer explained. "He's been informed that he can no longer park his commercial vehicles on any residential street in the area. He's allowed to stop briefly to load items, but extended parking is prohibited." I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me. "Thank you, officer. I really appreciate you looking into this." "No problem, sir. If you have any further issues, please don't hesitate to call." As I hung up the phone, I allowed myself a small smile. It wasn't a complete victory. I doubted Mike would suddenly become a model neighbor, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a definite change in the neighborhood. Mike's big stake bed truck was conspicuously absent from its usual spot in front of my house. Instead, I'd see it parked in his driveway when it wasn't out on rounds. The other neighbors seemed to have gotten the memo as well. Suddenly, there was always plenty of parking available on our street. Mike, for his part, avoided me like the plague. On the rare occasions when we'd cross paths, he'd shoot me a venomous glare before hurrying in the opposite direction. I can't say it bothered me much. As the months passed, life settled into a new rhythm. The pandemic continued, keeping me working from home and giving me a front row seat to the comings and goings of the neighborhood. Mike's business seemed to slow down, whether from the economic downturn or the new restrictions, I couldn't say. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt about that, but I quickly squashed it. He'd brought this on himself with his stubborn refusal to be a considerate neighbor. Eventually, an opportunity came up at work for an overseas position. After months of being cooped up at home, the idea of a fresh start in a new country was too tempting to pass up. As I packed up my belongings and prepared for the move, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange turn my life had taken. I'd moved into this neighborhood looking for peace and quiet, only to find myself embroiled in a petty war with a junk-collecting landscaper. It wasn't how I'd imagined spending my time, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction I felt at having stood up for myself. As I drove away from my house for the last time, I caught sight of Mike watching from his porch. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I thought I saw a flicker of something, regret, relief, cross his face. Then he turned and went inside, closing the door firmly behind him. I turned my attention to the road ahead, ready for whatever new adventures and hopefully better neighbors awaited me in my next chapter.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.